The PS2 is a universally beloved console and holds one of the most storied histories of any console ever made. A lot of that history is common knowledge, with many people knowing that the PS2 was supported with games up until the release of PES 2014 in, well, 2013, or that the console has sold 160 million units to date. There are some facts and stories that aren't quite as well known though, so we're here to talk about PS2 facts you might not have maybe possibly heard of. Number 1. Halo on PS2 nearly happened. In a certain time period, it would have felt almost sacrilegious that Halo, the poster child for the Xbox console, could have been played on the PS2, but it almost came to pass. It's almost common knowledge at this point that Halo started out life as a project built for Mac before developers Bungie pivoted to console development, but before Halo Combat Evolved debuted on the original Xbox, Bungie had been working on a prototype for a PS2 version. While nothing had been confirmed about a solid PS2 release for the original Halo, Bungie did have a deal with Take-Two to publish some of their games on console, including the long-forgotten Oni. So it was assumed that the first Halo would have received some kind of multi-platform release too. Bungie never got the game running on PS2, but it was something they were looking at doing, whether through a porting partner or otherwise. There's actually a sense of urban myth surrounding Halo on PS2, with IGN sharing some purported footage of it running on the console, but this simply isn't the case, as the footage isn't of that version of the game at all. Weird situation this, just like with the whole Halo on DS myth, also started by IGN. Weird. But back to Halo on PS2, Microsoft ended up buying Take-Two's stake in Bungie, effectively gaining a controlling stake in the developer, making Halo exclusive as a result. Microsoft, Bungie and Take-Two all came together to iron out a deal whereby Take-Two gained some properties and the rights to the Halo engine for 2 games, while Microsoft gained the rights to Halo, making it the Xbox's biggest exclusive in the process. PlayStation owners might have been robbed back then, but now, in 2024, Xbox are reportedly considering bringing the Halo series over to PlayStation, while Bungie is now a subsidiary of Sony Interactive Entertainment. It might have taken 24 years or something, but talk about having your cake and if you like it you should put a Halo ring on it too. Or something. That's not our best. That's not our best. Number 2. Hey dog, we heard you like PS2 and TV, so we put a PS2 in your TV. PS2s are great and all, but you need a TV of some sort in order to be able to actually play the thing, so wouldn't it be really convenient for someone to just shove a working PS2 inside a TV? Sony seemingly agreed with this sentiment as they decided to release the Sony Bravia PX300 model of TV. While the PS2 isn't inside the TV per se, it does form the TV's base, meaning you'd need to clear a decent bit of room in order to get the TV to actually fit on your table, desk or whatever other device you're using to rest your TV on. Please don't be a chair, guys, come on. The Sony Bravia 2DL22PX300, to give it its full title, is a 22-inch LCD TV that was able to output in up to 720p. The PS2 at the TV's base is wired internally using a component video connection, so the Bravia PX300 TV is arguably one of the best ways to experience PS2 games using actual hardware and not emulation. However, the reason why the Bravia TV is considered both a rare find and a piece of lesser known PS2 trivia in general is the fact that the Bravia PX300 was only available in the UK in December of 2010. You know, a few years after the PS3 had already been available. Clearly, Sony now needs to make some kind of TV with a PS3 built into it, or a PS4, or a Vita. Oh, I'd buy 7 of them. At the time, the Sony Bravia PX300 retailed for around £200, but due to the TV's rarity, the TV now sells on eBay for anywhere from £600 to £2,000. Yeah, how many are you buying, guys? Number 3, it boasted PSP connectivity. Nintendo has always been known as a ruler of handheld consoles, specifically when it comes to connectivity between handhelds and the home console. Plenty of titles allowed some kind of connection between the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube, but the PS2 and PSP also offered connectivity of its own. While you might mainly remember the PS3 and PSP working together pretty well, a decent amount of the games that were able to connect from PS2 to PSP and vice versa mainly allowed players to transfer their saves from one console to another, with WWE, SmackDown vs Raw 2006, FIFA 08 and Outrun 2006 being some of the most notable examples. Being able to continue your career on the daily commute before picking up back home was incredibly forward-thinking for Sony. There were a few games that also offered some other interesting connectivity benefits though. Crash Tag Team Racing and Micro Machines V4 would unlock version-specific tracks and vehicles on both the PS2 and PSP, while Jack X would connect with Daxter to unlock a new vehicle in the latter. We promise they're not all about racing games though. Perhaps the most ambitious use of this feature is SOCOM's Crosstalk, which would give players unlocks and crucially change the gameplay of missions depending on the player's performance in the paired game. For example, rescuing a group of resistance fighters in one mission in SOCOM 3 would let you infiltrate an objective in SOCOM Fireteam Bravo a lot easier. It was bold and brilliant for the time. Number 4, it was crossplay with other platforms. Crossplay has almost become a commodity we've taken for granted in gaming, as the ability for console gamers and PC gamers, depending on the game in question, to play together regardless of their platform is a good thing. It keeps games populated, shortens queue times, and allows friends to stay together. It's a wonderful feature, and while it took until the middle years of the PS4 and Xbox One era for crossplay to become an adopted feature across the majority of the gaming industry, thanks largely to Fortnite if you want to give it the credit, the PS2 beat them all to it with Final Fantasy XI. When the MMORPG was released in 2002, the game offered crossplay with PC players, a first for the genre. Later, Final Fantasy XI would even offer crossplay with the Xbox 360 release as Microsoft tried to grow its install base in Japan. We all know how that went. While Final Fantasy XI might be the more prominent example, it's far from the only one. Need for Speed Underground allowed for online play between PS2 and PC along with Phantasy Star Universe, but the first example ever of crossplay between two competing console platforms goes to Capcom vs SNK 2 Mark of the Millennium 2001. While the online portion of CVS2 was only available within Japan, it did allow players to compete against others online via their PS2 or Sega Dreamcast, earning the distinction of being the first crossplay game ever. And then the PS2 picked up the ball from there. Number 5, the reason behind different disc colours. It's an established fact at this point that some PS2 discs just happen to be blue, but the reason why isn't quite as well known. We'll admit that it's probably the most well known of all the facts on this list maybe, but we're willing to bet that some people still think that the discs were blue just because it looked cool. That's certainly part of the reason, because it did look cool and blue discs are very awesome, and more discs these days should feature bold and weird colours, but the reasoning came down to the difference between CD-ROM and DVD-ROM. Essentially, if your disc was blue, or black in the case of PS1 discs, you were playing a CD-ROM disc, while the silver gold finish indicated a DVD-ROM. The functional difference between the two is that the CD-ROM could only hold about 700 megabytes of data, while the DVD-ROM held up to nearly 5 gigabytes. If developers were making a game that was smaller in size or scope, it'd be much cheaper for them to distribute physical copies using CDs instead of DVDs, hence why some PS2 discs were blue. More often than not, these discs would also end up being the first games in your collection to become useless, as the CD-ROM part of the PS2's Laserdisc drive would often be the first to fail. Number 6, your saves used to cry. Does anyone else miss when video games were just a tad more whimsical? We certainly do. We long for the days of memory cards filled with your various game saves, each with their own unique icons, and the PS2 was filled with them. Game-specific icons for your saves isn't an unknown PS2 fact by any means, but it's the extra details that certain developers went to that makes this fact pretty special. Some devs were just content on sticking key art on the side of a cube or simply making a 3D version of the game's logo and calling it a day, but there were some icons that were truly special. Games like God Hand, Ridge Racer, Mr. Mosquito, and countless others would have a character model or mascot related to the game performing some cute animation, and they'd even have their own reactions if you want to copy or delete the save file. Tekken Tag might have one of the more brutal animations, with Xiao Yu breaking down crying on the floor if you happen to select the delete save option. Come on man, you don't want to make her cry now, do you? That's it, delete your PS5 Master League save instead. Maybe if PS5 had John Terry and Thierry Henry having a breakdown, we'd delete something else instead. Number 7, people still play their PS2 online today. We mentioned earlier how the PS2 had been at the forefront of online gaming in a lot of ways, and its contributions are often overlooked compared to both the Dreamcast before it and the Xbox after it. Xbox Live and Halo 2 did kind of surge way ahead, to be fair, but those on Sony's console had plenty of online gaming to sink their teeth into. They had so much, in fact, that even though all the online services for these games have been nuked into oblivion long ago, talented teams of modders and emulators have worked behind the scenes to ensure that a vast majority of PS2 games are still playable online. While you might struggle today to find people looking to play Greg Hastings Tournament Paintball Maxed Online is there truly no justice, PS2 Online is a community that offers online access to a variety of PS2 games. On top of that, various communities have sprung up around specific games, with SOCOM Community and Outbreak Server Resurrection leading the charge on people who want to play SOCOM and Resident Evil Outbreak online today. They're niche communities, to be frank, so don't go there expecting Fortnite or even like Cuisine Royale numbers. Is that still a thing? Cuisine Royale? But you can find plenty of dedication and enthusiasm for some of the PS2's online classics. Meanwhile, we'll keep pitching for Sony and Capcom to make a new SOCOM or Outbreak, please and thank you. Outbreak just makes so much sense. So much sense. Number 8, someone changed their name to Mr. PS2. A silly one this, granted, but worth bringing up nonetheless. The 2000s to early 2010s were seemingly full of people who'd either changed their names or promised to name their kids after famous video games or consoles, usually with the view of earning a bit of notoriety or free swag from the developers and publishers. Remember all those sprogs called Turok for a bit there? The couple who named their kid Dovahkiin after the player character in Skyrim also spring to mind, with Megan and Eric Kellermeyer receiving free Bethesda games for life in the process. How's that copy of Starfield working out, guys? While the Dovahkiin moment happened back in 2011, an English guy by the name of Dan Holmes had them beat by nearly a decade when he changed his name to Mr. PlayStation 2. According to reports from the time, Dan changed his name via deed poll, a process which is easier and cheaper to do than changing the details on your Ryanair tickets. Donning the name Mr. PlayStation 2, Dan did the media rounds, talking about how he was made fun of for his gaming habits and that he even wanted to marry his PS2, but couldn't find a vicar who was willing. In truth, Dan Holmes probably wanted to get 15 minutes of fame for something silly and figured becoming Mr. PS2 was worth a shot. British media was filled with chances like that in the 2000s, though it certainly paid off for some. Where Dan Holmes ended up after the Mr. PS2 incident is unclear, though PlayStation Lifestyle speculate that Dan changed his name back to Mr. Dan, sorry, probably just Dan, pretty soon afterwards and returned to his normal, non-console named life. Number 9, it kind of supported HD, kind of. One of the big benefits of moving from the PS2 to the PS3 was the fact that the PS3 offered true native support for high-definition gaming. Home TV displays were moving from CRTs to flat-screen plasma TVs, LCD monitors and beyond, which were capable of much better quality visuals, and gaming needed to move with those times too. However, a little-known fact about the PS2 is that it did support high-definition gaming. You know, kind of. Barely, sorta. While a lot of games often supported 16:9 widescreen displays and would run at a maximum of 480p in resolution, a select 3 games in total were able to run in 1080i, which just about meets the requirements of high definition gaming-ish. Kind of. You see, the PS2 wasn't actually running at 1080i natively, but instead was rendering games at around 640 by 540, then upscaling the image to fill the interlaced 1920 by 540 frames of the 1080i. It's not really true HD in all honesty, but it was a sign of the improving technology available to both players and developers that some developers tried to experiment with an early version of HD on the PS2. As for the games that were available in this visual mode, you have Gran Turismo 4, Tourist Trophy, and Valkyrie Profile 2 Silmerium as confirmed supporters of 1080i, while some have also said that NHL 2004 and Jackass the Game, of all things, are also 1080i capable. However, the feature was only available for PS2s in the US and Japan. But you Brazilians, you got something pretty cool instead. Number 10, the Brazilian Netflix. The idea that you could watch Netflix via your PS2 sounds absolutely ludicrous, but if you happen to be living in Brazil between 2009 and 2012, it was your reality. But first, we're going to have to give quite a bit of background. Due to issues regarding both piracy and Brazil's astronomically high import tax rate, which is the same reason why the Genesis was so popular for so many years there, the PS2 only officially went on sale in 2009 in Brazil. Before then, retailers would purchase PS2 units from Paraguay and sell them for a fraction of what Sony would. Meanwhile, any PS2 that was around in Brazil would often be jailbroken, which meant piracy would stop legitimate game sales in their tracks. Anyway, Sony dodged the tax problem by manufacturing PS3s in Brazil, and PS2 started selling in Brazil not long afterwards. Meanwhile, Microsoft managed to strike a deal with Netflix to reserve the rights for instantaneous film streaming on console, which Sony and Nintendo managed to circumvent by offering Netflix on disc. This disc-based version would have the same benefits as the app and give players access to the full service, but you just needed that disc to use it. With Sony manufacturing the PS3 and its Netflix discs anyway, and the PS2 just going on sale in Brazil, the decision was made to include PS2 in this Netflix deal, resulting in Brazilian-only PS2 Netflix discs. It's kind of wild to think about now, but in a way the PS2 was the prototype for consoles becoming the all-in-one media centers that the PS5 and Xbox Series X and S have become. Number 11, the design was inspired by Atari. The original PS2's design is iconic, the big, beautiful, beefy beefster, even if you could cut yourself on its various points and angles, but original isn't a good word for it, really. Instead, it should be known that the design for the first model of PS2, otherwise known as the Fat PS2, was inspired by an old, unreleased prototype of an Atari console. The Atari Falcon 030 utilised a wedge design when it was originally released, but Atari began prototyping a microbox case for the next model, the 040. This microbox version would be able to stand either horizontally or vertically and contained enough angles and edges to make a cubist artist blush. As you can no doubt guess, this unused prototype design ultimately formed the basis of the PS2's core design, and when you stick both consoles together side by side, the resemblance is simply uncanny. Sony even mentioned the Atari Falcon's prototype design in the patent for the PS2, so it's clear that the Falcon was an inspiration for the design of the PlayStation 2. However, Sony also had the incredible idea to make the console black with a blue trim instead of this boring grey obelisk, so you can't say that Sony didn't add their own touch to the design. It also didn't have a floppy disk port in it. Boo! Maybe Sony improving on the design was their little taunt for Atari trying to block the release of the PS1, but who knows. Roll the $2.99 clip. $2.99. Bonus fact, the black represented space and the blue represented Earth. Nice. Number 12, it could be turned into a Linux machine. One of the coolest aspects of the PS1 was Netgear Rose, the tool that allowed players to make and share their own games from the comfort of their own home, and Sony did allow players to do the same again with the PS2. Released in 2002, the Linux kit for PS2 was released by Sony Computer Entertainment and included all the tools you'd need to turn your PS2 into a computer ready to make your own games. While getting hold of a legit copy of this rare find can be pretty difficult now, 20 years after the fact, there are still plenty of tutorials and guides out there on the internet for anyone who wants to enter the crazy world of PS2 Linux gaming. There you go, Kadigarus, there's a new video for you. We won't spend too much time on this fact, as Sony kind of kept the Linux capabilities quiet. We also don't understand it and it scares us, and support for the PS2 version of Linux Online ended in 2009. A year later, the PS3 version of OS would also be nuked, terminating the PlayStation and Linux partnership for good. Despite the end of this partnership, thinking about consoles as computers did lead to some interesting results, which is a neat segue into this next fact. Number 13, it nearly sparked an international incident. I don't even really know where to start with this one, other to say that the PS2 almost became the centerpiece of an international incident somehow. Let's break it down wickety whack. In early 2000, just after the release of the PS2 within the region, Japan instituted heavy export controls on the PS2 as the Japanese government argued that components of the PS2 could be used for military purposes, particularly missile guidance systems, as components of the console were able to process multiple high-quality images quickly. Essentially, Japan was worried that if someone strapped a bunch of PS2s together, someone would be able to control missiles like Raiden wielding a Nikita in Metal Gear Solid 2. Sony were faced with the choice of either paying heavy penalties from the government or applying for special exemption. They chose the latter, and the Japanese government gave permission for Sony to export to all countries except Libya, North Korea, Iran, and crucially Iraq. We'll circle back to that one. What's interesting about this story in hindsight is that the Japanese government had every right to be concerned, as research conducted in the years since proved the viability of consoles as makeshift supercomputers. You just need to strap a bunch of them together, apparently, like it's Team Fortress 2 or something. The National Center for Supercomputing Applications created a PS2 supercomputer back in 2003, while the US Army even managed to create one of the world's most powerful supercomputers by strapping nearly 1,800 PS3s together. All this talk of console supercomputing did lead to a report, read bollocks, total bollocks, from right-wing website World News Daily that the then leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had purchased around 4,000 PS2 consoles with a view of combining the computing power of all of them in order to advance their military technology on the cheap. Remember, Iraq could not import PlayStation 2s. The story was considered ridiculous even at the time, though the tale has stuck around over the years like other gaming urban legends. You've got Polybius, Minecraft's Herobrine, I don't know, I'm not 12, and Saddam's big old PS2 computer. Think of the Soul Calibur 2 LAN parties that guy could have had. What a shame. Number 14, it did Sneak King before Sneak King. We're vultures of culture here, and what that means is that we love weird crap. So it should be a surprise to learn that we unironically love Sneak King, a Burger King stealth game based on the iconic mascot. You know, the one with the terrifying head that'd haunt your dreams for the rest of your life? Yeah, that guy. Back in 2006, BK released 3 themed Xbox/Xbox 360 games that were sold pretty cheaply in North American stores, those being Pocket Bike Racer, Big Bumpin', I love that, Big Bumpin', and Sneak King. So far, so well known, but the king was beaten to the punch by the PS2 and McDonald's, kind of Big Bumpin'. While McDonald's didn't exactly release their own game, complete with mascot Ronald McDonald running around and scaring the crap out of people, which he would, that clown is straight up nightmarish. McDonald's Japan did enter a partnership with Sony to release the McDonald's Happy Disc. Sold only at McDonald's, this Happy Disc contained demos of Parappa the Rapper 2 and Ape Escape 2001, the Japan-only remake of the first Ape Escape, but these demos were altered to feature McDonald's branding all over the shop, or restaurant. There's monkeys eating burgers, a McDonald's blimp, and Parappa is even flipping burgers inside of McDonald's in a remade version of that game's first level. Hey, we know it's an extremely long shot these days and probably wouldn't have the same effect, but Sony could at least try and make a demo disc for PS5 to be given away at McDonald's, right? You could put Astro Bot on there. Easy winner every time. Chicken nugget dinner, easy winner. Number 15, an official Sega Saturn controller, ? Exclamation. There was a lot of weird controllers for the PS2. We're not just talking about the peripherals either, like the Guitar Hero controllers or the motion control straps that let you play golf badly. No, just some honest-to-goodness oddball controllers like the Resident Evil 4 chainsaw controller serving as the most obvious example. There's also the Dragon Quest Slime controller, which is about as cute as it is uncomfortable to use, the Final Fantasy X-2 Gun controllers, and the Onimusha Free Katana controller. Oh, and let's not forget the Res Transpad thing. It vibrated as you sat on it. Joe, do not put that on screen. Joe, do not put that on screen, okay? Moving on, perhaps the oddest controller of them all was this monstrosity released by Sega, the Fukokuban Sega Saturn control pad for PlayStation 2. As the name suggests, it's a functioning Sega Saturn controller repurposed for use on the PlayStation 2. They've added a select button, but that's about it, with the same 6 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons having to be translated to work on the PS2. There aren't any analog control sticks either, so a lot of PS2 games would be simply incompatible to play with it. Even though the Sega Saturn controller for the PS2 is deeply unsuited for playing on the console, it's interesting to look at the timeline of Sony and Sega's relationship during the PS2 generation. The PS2 released competing with Sega's Dreamcast, but by 2006, just before the release of the PS3, the two companies would collaborate to unleash this unholy abomination on the world. Or well, just Japan really, just Japan. I do actually own that Resident Evil chainsaw controller. I got it for real cheap because there's no cable with it, so it just kind of sits there menacingly. And that was our video looking at some cool PS2 facts and kittens about the PS2, if you can believe it. We would love to do more stuff like this, so if you want to watch more stuff like this, let us know down in the comments down below. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, and thank you for watching.